People who moved from cities to small towns, what was the biggest culture shock? Story 1. Of course it matters where you've moved, but when you enter a restaurant or bar, everyone turns to see who's come in. At first it was off-putting, then you realize they're just looking to see if it's someone they know. Story 2. I lived in Vermont for a time, and small-town life required a lot more planning. The grocery store was a 45-minute drive, so if you went once a week and forgot something, you did without it. Four-wheel drive was a must. The people were more friendly and tolerant than I expected. Like the big city, no one really gave a what other people did. People in the suburbs seem a lot more conformist than people in the city or in rural areas. Story 3. People say hi to you on the sidewalk. First time it happened, I looked around behind me thinking it was someone else, but there was only me. So I said, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" And he was like, "No, I was just being friendly," and I felt so bad. Because the city I grew up in, you did not make eye contact with strangers, let alone say anything to them. Story 4 actually grew up rural, then lived in the city for a while, then went back to rural. The thing that really struck me was how lots of townies think they have a lot of life experience when they don't. I suppose it's easy to think you've seen when you've never been anywhere else to compare. I say this came as a shock because I never really noticed it before I spent some productive years in the city. Story 5. I moved back to Texas from California 15 years ago, and I was shocked at the politeness. When you walk into a store, people said, "Hello, how are you?" And you were expected to stop and answer them before going about your business. You had to say, "I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing today?" It's a very small town, and I ran into questions like having a police officer asking me where the hell I was from when I reported a weed whacker, lawnmower, and loppers stolen. He said, "What the hell is a lopper?" Story 6. We live in the town of Sonoma in California after living in Boston and San Francisco. What's interesting is that in a small town, we've noticed that everybody went to grade school and the high school together. The roots run deep. They're super nice to us. It's almost like a farm community, but we're always going to be outsiders. Another thing I noticed is that when we throw parties, my wife and I are somewhat uninhibited, and we will sing karaoke or something. They haven't been socialized the same way we have with receptions, sales calls, and business trips, etc. At parties, you can see them kind of close off when they're confronted with socializing of people they don't know. They just don't have that gear. I didn't grow up in a big city, but I lived 2 hours from NYC, Boston, and Providence, so there was a lot of big city influence in my area. I moved from New England to a very, very rural and conservative county located in western KY. This was September 2019. Things got weird after that. What shocked me was how uptight folks were. This includes the family I was staying with whilst I got myself situated. The Southern hospitality was refreshing, but I had a hard time trusting people once the Southern Belle mask came off. I felt I had to be careful about sharing my progressive views. I couldn't be my true self because eyes full of judgment would lock onto me. During a staff holiday party, our marketing manager, who was also a local pastor, was capturing boomerangs to post on our company's Instagram. I did a very simple, subtle shimmy and instantly got told to tone it down a bit. I felt a part of my soul shrink at that moment. The fake niceness of folks was not something I was used to either, especially since I spent 25 years of my life in New England where folks are blunt and you know right away where you stand with someone. Folks cared so much about their public persona and how their small-town peers perceived them. It was a lot of pressure for me, someone who couldn't care less about the opinions of others. There was a tipping point between my family, a couple of repressed drunk husbands who got too touchy, and that resulted in me cutting off all contact with them. They essentially gave me a scarlet letter and refused to hear my side of the situation. Between this family fallout and it being peak COVID times, I had no support or community outside of my coworkers for 7 months after that. But I'll save that story for another day. I moved to the nearest big city the moment I got a job offer. I am much happier, found my community, and am able to be my true self. Shimmy and all. Story 7 moved from a very large city of millions to a town with a population under 1K. I was shocked that everyone there knew everyone, and most were related in some way to one another. All news was the talk of the day. If someone had a baby, that baby was the most famous person in the town that day. The day I moved in, I had no less than 60 people pull over, introduce themselves, and offer to help. I had at least a dozen people bring food to me. They already knew me by name because my landlord lived in the town and told everyone he rented the place to me. The day I after moved in, there was a funeral for someone who lived in the town. Every store, all 3, including the gas station, was closed for the day. The bar opened at 6, and everyone in the town stopped by. But it's so goddamn boring. Living in a small town is like Groundhog Day. Some old lady burned a pie and caught her stove on fire. She put it out with a fire extinguisher. There was no damage, no fire truck. The oven still worked. Still, you not. For 3 days, I was involved in conversations about how Mrs. M must have dementia. She's normally a great baker, Won the bake-off a few years back. Her kid needs to leave college and move back home to take care of her, etc. The lady was 65 and fell asleep. It was nothing but still. There wasn't else to do but drink and gossip. That. Story 8. I wouldn't say I lived in a big city, but I lived and grew up near Chicago. We got all their TV and news, etc., but weren't in what you'd call the suburbs. When I moved with my wife to a rural area, the first thing I recall was people driving by the house and waving at us. I kept asking her, "Who is that?" because she grew up down here and I thought she knew them. No one waved back home. No one really said hello either. Too much hustle and bustle where I'm from. Things are more laid back here, but there is also fewer opportunities to be had. Story 9. People seem super nice, and if you never get too deep, you might never know better. They don't openly talk about their violently racist and xenophobic opinions, formed in an almost complete vacuum devoid of facts because their schools are terrible and their teachers from the area, and they don't know what they don't know. And it's not because they know they should be ashamed. It's because they take it for granted that you share their revolting ideas because everyone they know shares their ideas. They don't talk about it because they assume they don't need to. And the instant you express something new, they react like you're a threat, which you are to their way of thinking. If you want a real friend, find out who the town weirdo witch is. That person is probably just a vegetarian or into astronomy who thinks there's probably life outside this planet. Source: 4 small towns in 4 states ranging from Wisconsin to North Carolina. Will never do it again. Story 10. Grew up outside of Dallas, spent my first 4 years out of college as a field engineer. Holy. The towns I was sent to barely qualify as villages. Less than 1,000 people, dying infrastructure, no signs of investment. Maybe a gas station and corner store if they are lucky. A coffee shop that's only open until 3 p.m. wouldn't be shocking. You meet people who have never left the state they were born in. A lot of times they don't know what exists more than a 4-hour drive away. It makes you wonder where our education system failed and why society doesn't care. Story 11. Walking into the small grocery store and listening to people talking to each other in line and with the cashier. I'm back there thinking, shut the F***K up and move along. 19 years later, and I'm one of those people. However, I'm still a newcomer, and that's fine with me because not everyone knows my business. I can just imagine what they think of me, though. Haha. Story 12. Coming from someone who is from a small town, moved to a big city, and occasionally goes back to see my folks. The weird amount of acceptance on certain things, but blatant judgment for others. I have to be careful about how much makeup and the clothes I wear whenever I go to visit, because they say everyone stares and no one dresses like that. I draw too much attention, etc. But the creepy guy from church that goes up and randomly touches women and apparently has been for months, oh, that's just how he is, we just ignore it. I've also mentioned that this creepy guy very clearly has some sort of mental problem, and they absolutely refuse to accept it. No, he's just an old man, when bro is very clearly not, and would never fly where I live now. Story 13. Just from personal experience, lack of diversity extends beyond the people you see. It shows in the way people think, the types of shopping available, the types of restaurants. Fast food and chain restaurants are alive and well, unlike big cities. Trends and new businesses take a while to hit, like popular workout classes, even to things like Uber availability. Story 14. The utter lack of anonymity, what I see as boundaryless behaviors, asking inappropriately personal questions, calling unfamiliar women hon or darlin', unsolicited advice from strangers that has no relevance, xenophobia, terrible food, rigorous insistence that small-town X has the GOAT X without ever experiencing anything else. I could go on. Story 15. This might just be a Canadian thing, but the casual against Indigenous people. I was visiting my parents in their not really that small town and got into a conversation at the liquor store about Scottish independence of all things, when the guy out of nowhere started ranting about how Indians don't pay tax incorrect and get everything for free, ECT and so on. Not the only time that or similar comments were made either. Story 16. Weirdly enough, it was returning to America after spending years abroad in Albania. As mentioned elsewhere in this thread, Albania didn't have any international food chains or restaurants. Everything was local and usually tasted great. I think what it was for me was when I was going to Albania, I psyched myself up. I knew I was going to a foreign country and that things would be different. And they were. Most stores were no bigger than the size of my bedroom back home. Open-air street markets were common and roadside shops were everywhere. Most people didn't own vehicles and walked or relied on public transportation. But when I returned to America, I was just going home and didn't really think about it much. But after several years, it was weird. The day after returning home, we went to a Costco. Walking around that place on that day was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Packages of food were huge and there was just so much of everything. We drove our cars everywhere and I realized my little hometown doesn't even have a proper bus system. That was easily my biggest culture shock. And it was about my own. Story 17. Moved from New Orleans to rural Louisiana for an internship for a research study. I was there 6 months. Here are some things I learned, none of which comes from the study. The amount of Mountain Dew a person can consume and still be alive astounds me. Getting your ass beat by someone means that now instead of 2 individuals fighting, 2 entire families will fight. I like Zydeco music. Pissing as public is fine, but pooping in public is poor manners. Everyone knows when you got paid and I will ask you to buy a round in the local dive. Socks are optional for men with dress shoes. Hand washing after using the toilet is also optional. Story 18. I grew up in the white-collar suburbs of a big city, then attended college at a state school in a small town. Small-town culture shocks. Most students and almost all townies were white. I'd never seen white people doing road work in my life. I am white. People mentioning that they'd never met a Jewish person or a Muslim person. No one's parents were paying for college. The campus was often quite smoky. I didn't know anyone who smoked cigarettes back home. This was approximately 15 years ago. The smoke levels were already starting to drop on campus by the time I graduated. Confederate flags here and there when you drove around the countryside. This was in Pennsylvania. Why? Story 19. I didn't come from a huge city, but it's the second biggest in our state. I moved to a city of a little under 300. Groceries are significantly more expensive. The closest Walmart is over 2 hours away. I really valued convenience, and we don't have that here. There's no DoorDash or Uber. Ordering something online is pretty annoying. It takes everything at minimum a week to get here. There's not really any decent jobs that aren't labor-intensive. I gave up my career that I loved to move out here, assuming that I could find a similar job, but nothing has ever opened up. No one ever really dresses nicely. I don't mean that as a put-down or anything. I used to put a lot of effort in my appearance. My makeup was always done, and I had a cute outfit on. It feels so out of place here, so just my preferred way to exist doesn't feel right. If you need a new outfit or something last minute, you're out of luck. The Closet Mall is 2 hours away. There's very limited activities here. There is almost nothing to do in the winter. My fiancé was raised here, and I wasn't. I don't think I will ever feel like this is my home. Ultimately, I do feel like it was a mistake to move here. Story 20. I moved to a small town that had early high-speed internet access because a lot of the new .com billionaires had second and third homes there. So I was an early adapter of online shopping since the town had limited retail, and most of it was very expensive. The funny thing was, when I moved back to my larger city 5 years later and realized other people were online shopping, even though they could just walk into Walmart and buy it. I also had to get used to doing one main shopping trip a month and only buying produce and perishables from the grocery store in town that had a 30% markup. When I moved back, it was a couple months before I realized I didn't have to do a month's worth of meal planning and one big shopping trip anymore. My experience was obviously different because it was a resort town, so it still had a fair number of restaurants and entertainment options. But the year-round population was only a few thousand, and eventually you realized you had 2 or 3 connections to almost everyone in town. Story 21. Moved from London to Sevenoaks, just outside M25. And even though I only moved 1.5 HRs away, the difference is huge. Quiet. People say hi to you more. People aren't in a rush. Walked around town with some new friends I made, and they kept asking me why I walk so fast and if I really need to overtake all these people on the pavement. Nearly been a year and already going back into the big city gives me a headache. Story 22. Born and raised in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. Left the state at 25 for Portland, Oregon in 1995. Best decision ever. Had to go back for family reasons in 2019, this time rural, north of Fort Worth, for 4 years. I've been back in Oregon since 2023, thank gods. Let me tell you what, nothing could prepare me for the MAGA yard signs, the MAGA parade trucks, the smug MAGA attitudes about COVID on every local FB group, no matter the topic, the polite but empty send-off for every interaction, even paying for gas, have a blessed day. And those same well-wishers would rip you anew for daring to wear a mask at Walmart, which, by the way, is the only store in town. The urban-rural divide is hard, real, and very soul-crushing. I'll never set foot in that state again. Rant over Story 23. When a large Maori man asked to touch noses with me in greeting. The dude looked pissed until I manned up and was the first to touch noses. Then he had one of the best smiles I've ever seen on a mountain of a man. It lit up the entire cultural center. Story 24. Yes, and I wasn't a fan. I honestly thought that cute small-town vibe was for me. I thought I'd be at Saturday Farmers Market with my basket and hat, and cute coffee shops on Saturday laughing with the locals, and all the thing you think you'd see in a movie. Yeah, I was young at the time, I know better now. Turns out most small towns can have a lot of drama and nothing to do. Especially if you have kids, you run out of things. More often than not, I was seen as the outsider who came from the big city, and PPL were weary I was there to change things. They assumed I wouldn't stay. They ended up being right. And so they weren't interested in getting to know me. Accessibility was an issue. This was pre-Amazon, so you couldn't get if it wasn't in town. And so driving far became a way of life. I moved back to a big city a decade ago, and while I may not live in the city itself forever, I'll stay in the outskirts of wherever I land next. Story 25. During the pandemic, my mom passed away, so for about 6 months I worked from her house in the boonies while clearing it out. I very quickly learned why people in small towns are so handy with even fairly complex home repair work. It was next to impossible to get someone to reliably show up to do any work for me. You must learn how to DIY most things because there's no choice. Back in my home, the DC metro area, I could place a phone call to countless home repair people, and someone would be over very quickly to do a competent job. In her home? Sure, I could sometimes find someone who would promise to show up but never actually did. It took 2 months before I found someone who finally got it done, and he was only available on weekends when he felt like it. Also, mail service and package delivery generally was painfully slow. High-speed internet was available, but very expensive. Everyone went to church simply because that was the only major social outlet. Story 26. The resistance to change was a shock for me. I grew up in a small town, but then lived in Tokyo in the Bay Area for a very long time. When I came back, I ended up for about 7 years in a small town in CA, and they actively didn't want the town to grow or get new industry jobs, even though there was a huge problem with unemployment. At one point, the former mayor told me that she never wanted the town, which had 8,000 people, to grow over 10,000, and was glad that a big business didn't open up there. It boggled my mind that so many people actively would prefer that there be no jobs because it'd keep the town smaller. Even with all of my small town experience growing up, that was a new one to me. Story 27. I grew up in a relatively poor neighborhood. A lot of rough going on there, but we won't discuss all of it. Suffice it to say, even at a fairly young age, I was pretty sure I'd seen some. In middle school, I made friends with a kid that lived in the trailer park across town. The trailer park kids are a whole different type of poor. I remember the kid I was friends with as soon as I got there goes, "Let's go to the creek. Darius got his fishing pole back." Okay, whatever the hell that means. So we go down to the creek, and there's this kid, Darius, and he's fishing in a creek, and there's about 12 kids standing around watching him. Every so often, he's catching a fish and handing it to one of the kids, and the kid is taking the fish and running off giddy as hell. He finally catches one and hands it to my friend. He and I skip off back to his trailer. My friend takes the fish, as is, puts it in the microwave, and then when the microwave beeps, he takes it out and starts eating it with a fork. Story 28. How important small talk is. In my previous city, population roughly 150K, people were usually okay with but did not expect small talk. Here, if you don't at least have a short conversation about weather before talking about business, paying for groceries, etc., and people will absolutely give you the cold shoulder next time you see them. Weirdly enough, I pass as my preferred gender nearly 100% of the time in the rural town where I live than in my old city, even when I wear more gender non-conforming clothes. In some ways, I feel safer here as a trans person than I did in my previous city, though it is an objectively much more transphobic place, simply because people here don't know what trans guys are and therefore never, ever clock me. Story 29. Moved from a city of 1M to a small town of 5K. No liquor stores within town limits. Dry. The only fast food was a McDonald's for about 20 miles. Gas was always more expensive. Everyone knew everyone's business. And it was a 25-minute drive to the nearest grocery store or sit-down restaurant. Plenty of great things about living in a small town, but the drawbacks were definitely there. Story 30. The difficulty of making friends. People in the cities I'm from are friendlier as a rule, open to having new friends and different types of friends, with different lives to theirs, dotted around the place. People chat with strangers in the street all the time. It's the norm. Here, people look at me like I'm mad if I talk to them in passing. This is especially hard when you're isolated. A chat with a stranger can be a tiny lifeline towards feeling like you're an actual human being, with some connection to the world. The smaller town people where I live seem to have a very closed attitude towards new friends. They have their established friend group and don't seem very open to new ones. I really don't fit in with women in my age group here, for reasons that matter much less in the cities, where people don't necessarily want to only have friends who share their life situation, such as being married, having kids, same type of work, etc. Story 31. The general attitude towards other people, especially strangers. Most are super friendly and helpful. It's all two-faced because they're absolutely talking the moment you walk away. But a win is a win, lol. I'd much prefer nice to my face than talk behind my back than rude to my face while also talking. One person will help me get my car out of a snowbank, the other will sneer as they drive by. Story 32. When you are in a city and sirens are flaring, you stay away. When you're in a small town and sirens are flaring, people follow and go to the disaster. I found this so weird. I thought stay away and let emergency responders do their thing, but one of the small towners said, but you might know someone who is hurt/involved. To me, that is all the more reason to stay away and not clog the incident. Also, when I leave the small town, I'm always anxious to go shopping. My small town has a movie theater, 3 grocery stores, Taco Bell, and McDonald's, lots of coffee shops. The population is 8,000. We have a rural hospital, but everyone buys helicopter healthcare policies. Story 33, country stink. A term I developed to describe the stink of the small town peoples. It's like they don't wash their underwear, or they just repeatedly themselves. The smell is in every store, and you know the person wearing pajamas is going to smell terrible before they even approach. Also, everyone stares at you in a small town. Story 34. I moved from Memphis, a city with a very high Black and Mexican Latino population, to a super small town in nowhere rural Appalachia. Small as in, my middle school had about 200 kids total. My first day of school, I was shook at how white everyone was. And I'm white. I just didn't know how undiverse things were. Story 35. I moved an hour to be closer to work. It never even dawned on us until the day of closing. Where's the mailbox? I talked to some coworkers that live nearby. Oh yeah, you have to go to the post office and get a P.O. box. So then comes the time to change our residence at the DMV. The house is 70 years old, but the DMV PC had a fit trying to change of address online. Had to go in and explain it to the help desk. They needed a supervisor to override the program to change. Story 36. From Manhattan for 10 years to a 600-person town, a complete lack of anonymity. You are seen and you are watched, even just coming and going. It's way harder to disappear into the backdrop, so to speak. You're more relevant to everyone's life, so you just have to get used to that fact. This also works to your advantage. You have friends that will let you borrow things, have stuff, or have help with lots of stuff you are working on. In a small community, helping others is a currency. Story 37. Trying to cross the street in Hanoi, Vietnam. You can spot somebody who just got in a mile away because the look of apprehension and confusion on their face as they try to figure out how to do it. There are very few crosswalks with walk signs. In most places, you look for a gap in the traffic and go. In Bangkok, you just make sure the flow of traffic would have time to stop before they hit you, and you just go and maintain a constant pace. In Hanoi, especially near the French Quarter, you just slowly walk into traffic. There are no gaps. You can sort of put your hand out to let people know you're going, but you just kind of maintain a slow, inching walking pace, and traffic will part around you. Scary AF the first time. Story 38. I went from Los Angeles to a town of 3K in the Sierra Nevada foothills. I never hit traffic. It doesn't enter into my thinking, unless someone with a Tesla and a canoe on top is making their way for a mountain weekend. I know every cop. I am a teacher, so I know most families in town. There's only a few places to eat out. Everything closes by 7 o'clock and 5 o'clock on Sundays. Amazon Prime deliveries take 5 days. I have a P.O. box because the mail doesn't come to my house. It doesn't matter how long you've lived here. If you weren't born here, you're not local. The same 10 legacy families hold every government seat. The only place that sells clothing is the Dollar General, Tractor Supply, and Ace Hardware. There are lots of tweakers and lots of people with rotted death. Smoking and sweating are prevalent. People really support one another. I know more people who live in my rural neighborhood than I did living in LA on a 5,000 scaffed lot. We help one another. Story 39. How quiet the whole place is. Did it for 4 years. Girlfriend is from a small town. And I hated how after 8 p.m. it was dead. Always that it was the same faces every damn day. Grew up and raised in a large city. Moving somewhere smaller just weirded me out and still does, even though we will move back towards her home in the near future with our kids. Story 40. I'm ready to move back to city because people are way more reclusive, stay inside a lot, rarely see them outside. 2. Shopping inconvenient. Need to drive 30 to 1 hours to city for shopping and entertainment. 3. A lot of people very handy, and DIY a lot of maintenance, and calling up service is expensive due to distance and lack of competition. 4. The pace is always slow and lots of unhealthy bodies, smokers, and beer bellies. 5. Need to do long commutes for quality service providers of anything because local lacks competition and get poor service for overpriced rates, mechanics, pest control, internet, sigh. 6. Public buildings and parks small and lacking things. 7. Friends and family in city reluctant to visit. 8. Part of large county, taxed like big city but without big city perks like hospitals and big public facilities. Property tax pays for things big cities only use. 9. Every other vehicle, large pickup truck with large engine which vibrates everything in 50 feet radius. Same folks also drivers that blind you and pass you on 2-lane highways. Just timing my move, these things feel more difficult with every year. Story 41. My culture shock was more pronounced as I moved from Los Angeles to a small town in Germany in the early 1990s. I went from 7x24 supermarkets and drugstores to a country that closed stores at 6:30 p.m. on weeknights. And they're closed on Wednesday afternoons too, and at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Now, in the past 35 years, Germany has changed their store closing laws, and supermarkets in my area are open until 10 p.m. Monday through Saturday. But back then, it was a major shock not being able to go shopping after work. Everyone went grocery shopping for the week on Saturday morning. Story 42. Moved from a small town to a big one, then for some time back to a really small one. First thing that really hit me was that people were so incredibly slow moving. It almost drove me crazy. Only 2 people in front of you in the line when grocery shopping? Still gonna take 10 minutes due to small talk and the cashier beeping one item at a time? I like the stress and anonymity in a big town way better. Story. 43 years back. I moved from one of the major cities in my state to a small, mostly Republican and white suburb. At the library in my former city, there was an entire room dedicated to foreign language books. Everything from books in Russian to Spanish to Korean to Tagalog. French is a second language for me, so I like to read books in French to keep my skills fresh and just for a change. So I walked into the small town's library and asked the librarian where the foreign language section was. She looked at me in complete seriousness and said, "Why would we need that?" What? Yeah, just drove the 45 minutes to my old library and got books there. I've been in small town for 30 years now. I'd like to say it changed, but it really hasn't. They now do have one shelf of foreign language books in our library, which was added when the new library was built about 15 years ago, so I guess it's a start. And yes, there are a number of non-English speaking people here as we've had a reasonable influx of families from Ukraine, India, and South Central America. Story 44. I've been living here for 15 years now, and I still can't get over how many businesses close for the weekend. There's just one store that sells HiFi equipment here, and because they're closed for the weekend, I've only been able to set foot in the place once. It should be one of my hangouts. I guess I should be grateful for the thousands of dollars I've saved, but I cannot understand why a business would close on the only 2 shopping days working people have. Who is their target clientele? The idle rich? Stay-at-home moms? The homeless? It's hardly just the stereo store, though. Even the supermarkets and the Walmart closes at night. That's right. Go there at night, and the doors are locked. Only the Waffle House stays open all night, LOL. Jeff Bezos is the only one who benefits from this situation. No wonder he's so rich. Story 45. I lived in Chicago near Wrigley Field. Then I moved to the farm fields in southeastern Wisconsin. The biggest shock wasn't all the Trump signs, but the lack of food options and the quality of restaurant options. In Chicago, I could throw a rock and hit any type of restaurant I desired. Now all I have is a McDonald's and a Subway. But I will say the local bar Friday fish fries are amazing in Wisconsin. Also, I now have to drive 20 minutes away to go 30 miles to get to the grocery store versus in Chicago, I would drive 20 minutes to go 3 miles to the grocery store. Story 46. I've made this comment before. I figured I'd share it again for you. I live in a very small town and can give you a couple examples. 1. Going to the store and seeing the only sheriff in town buying 40-ounce beers in his full uniform. 2. Ice cream machine in the pharmacy. 3. Went to the only gas station in town and asked, "How did your bear hunt go this year?" 4. Drivers coming to a full stop when they see a deer on the side of the road and yell, "Meh!" just to see if they can make it stop in its tracks broadside. I call it practicing their maze. 5. The entire town gathering around to watch a fight happening outside the bar. I could go on, but I seriously wouldn't have it any other way. I love the small town life. Story 47. Rock concerts in Japan. You have a number on your ticket, and everyone queues according to that number. Yes, they managed a queue of hundreds of people in front of a venue according to the order in which they bought their ticket. It's fair. If you buy your ticket early, you can get the chance for a better spot, and you have a chance to buy limited merch that is usually sold out after minutes. When the venue opens, they call out every number, and as soon as yours is called out, you can go in. They do that every time. They do that at small venues with 20 people waiting, and they do that at festivals. Another thing, even after 2 days of festival, the venue is clean AS. Not one water bottle, not one wrapping paper or anything. I was at Summer Sonic Fuji Rock and Osaka Met Rock, and it was clean everywhere. Story 48 came from Des Moines, where we rode one bus to school and a different bus home. So when the new place gave me my bus schedule, I didn't think anything of it, and got on bus 12, then got yelled at by the bus driver for not realizing I should be riding the same bus back home, and also for not knowing my address, when we had literally moved in the night before. I was told there's no way you rode a different bus home than you do to school. That doesn't make any sense. Story 49. For me, it was the accepted level of incompetence, and this wasn't a tiny town, still 35K people. My favorite anecdote about it. I lived in an apartment. I'm up late, 2 or 3 a.m. The cable goes out, and with it, the internet. No big deal, I'll just go for a little walk. They always get it sorted eventually. I see the cable company truck out, and the worker next to it. He has just about every cable in the town in the air and disconnected. I casually ask how long until the cable's back. Oh, the cable shouldn't be out. Curious, I probed a bit more, and he legitimately did not understand that when he disconnected the cable, that it would stop working for people. And he wasn't unique. It was with everything. Sometimes the postman would just drop everyone's mail and leave it. More than once we got the mail for the next building over dumped. I had to explain to a cop why I stopped when he turned on his lights. Only place I've ever lived where the water went out. It would rain and suddenly the sewer system became a geyser network in an earthquake-prone area, but the buildings were flimsy enough to shift in the wind. It was insane. Story 50. So I'm Norwegian, but I went to New Zealand for a year. The culture shock for me was how open Kiwis talk and how there's no such thing as stranger danger. And as a typical Norwegian introvert, it took a while to get used to. I'd meet a stranger and they'd be breaking the touching barrier right away and start talking about their cousin's rash and all their weekend plans. Even bigger shock returning to silent Norway. Story 51. Having to drive an hour 2 counties away to purchase alcohol, ETA. Having to provide a social security card and 2 personal references to get a library card in which you were only allowed to check out 1 book at a time for 6 months until you had established a lending history. Story 52. How much the population despises education. No joke. They refuse to fund repairs to the schools that are literally falling apart because they don't want to pay more taxes. They have 1 administrator for each building and then complain that teachers aren't doing enough. The class sizes are so large that kids have to sit at the teacher's desk, but of course parents complain the teachers don't do enough for their kids. Seriously, I hate my small town so much, but we have so much invested here that we will bankrupt ourselves if we leave. Story 53. So many caricatures of small towns here in the comments. My experience is typical of many small towns. It is a 20-minute drive to any store, and that is the big small town that has the stores. Kind of a hassle if you need something, like you ran out of bread or whatever. It is at minimum a 45-minute experience. So I make considerable efforts to get everything I need when I go shopping, anticipating certain things that are more likely to run out and buy extra of those. So in essence, when I shop, get a little more than you need. If something is left over from the last trip, I don't have to buy as much next time, but always overshoot what I need. People are not nosy here at all, and in fact, of the about 20 houses on the few-mile stretch of road, I only know the people beside me and have met the guy across the way, about 200 yards across. I am sure if I attended a local church or something, I would probably experience some of that nosiness. But here's the thing. When I lived near SF Bay, you know what I experienced with the organizations I belong to? Nosiness and rumors. I think this just tends to be true of any social grouping small enough that most know most others. Happens in the city, too. In any case, I do not attend any local church or anything, so there is not enough people around me to have a rumor. Been stuck inside in the past year due to long COVID or some such thing? I'm not sure, but my neighbors noticed. One neighbor every several months popped over to ask if everything was okay. I view that as kind and considerate. People on Reddit, judging by comments they make, would consider that a terrible invasion. The neighbors actually give a damn about you and offer help if they can. The other neighbor would cut my grass without asking. If they can help in some way, they will. The main downside of living in my small town is it is harder to get services. Any service, be it a plumber or whatever, is going to have to drive a lot more to get out where I am, so they often won't. I put solar on my house, for example. To put on the big dollar system, they would come out. Have some problem that requires troubleshooting. Damn near impossible. It is not worth their time to drive for such a small thing. And the quality of local services can vary. There are fewer of any given professional. And if they are all mediocre, well, those are your options. If you think the professional from the larger city an hour away is going to come out, well, you can just forget about that. That is the biggest downside I've experienced. Other than that, it has been quite nice. Perfect? No. Overall better than the burbs, I think so in most ways. Story 54. I assume people lived in small towns for the same reason as me, no other choice/job. There are people who actually like it. Also the food. I eat out every day, or I did. The food is so bad. I thought rural areas would have more fresh fruits and veg, but no. Every salad I got was wilting. They are also very isolated. Technically, I'm near a city if I drive for 55 miles, but it's a poor excuse of one. They don't even have a cheesecake factory. Just going to Olive Garden or Red Lobster is an HR drive. If you have some normal shops, I have to drive nearly 2 HRS, and if I was in an actual city, 3.5 HRS. I really want to leave. People in cities also talk about wanting the hole-in-the-wall, greasy diner, but I'm literally vomited from the awful non-chain restaurants. In cities, chains are looked down on. In rural towns, a chain is the cleanest, best quality food you'll get. Story 55. How everybody knows immediately if something happens in your family, if the family member live in the same town. Once my grandfather fell watching the local parade. An ambulance came to check him out. Lucky it wasn't serious, and my mother was with him, so texted us immediately what happened. Because it probably looked way worse for other people. They knew he was my grandpa, but somehow thought he died. So I received condolences from multiple people. Right, the ambulance even left with my grandparents to bring them home. Grandpa was fine, but dizzy, so the ambulance personnel didn't want him to walk home. Story 56. Best. Traffic. You can get wherever you need to go in a reasonable amount of time, and don't have to spend a half hour looking for parking when you get there. Worst. Food. Panda Express is the pinnacle of Chinese dining here. The grocery stores are well stocked, and there are even a couple of ethnic markets here, so you can cook up a storm, but the restaurant situation is very sad. Weirdest? There's a definite feeling of you don't belong here from some people, especially the older ones. A lot of anti-California cracks. I thought that only happened in the movies. Most surprising, there are way more liberal types here than I would have thought, but since we're in heavily conservative territory, it's like we have to send each other secret signals when we meet in public. Haha. Story 57. The inability of people to mind their own business. It's pretty incredible how important the lives of others are to some people. Being fired for having a mental illness after asking for ADA accommodations. The duality of people really was shown after I moved to a small town in Arkansas from the LA area, Eastern LA County native. People are so incredibly two-faced, it's incredible. At least at home, people are a complete to-your-face. Story 58. I found moving to a small town to be very cliquey. Not only was it isolating living in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't feel welcomed or included in things, which was surprising. My wife grew up there, and a lot of her family still lives there. Always just felt like an outsider. The money and mortgage was great, but other than that, it sucked. The quiet was nice, but it got old. I felt like we were on an extended camping trip. Just nothing to do ever. Also, the lack of anonymity sucked. No, I don't want to talk to somebody every time I go to get eggs and milk. I'd rather have less money living in a city where options are endless. There are some pros to living in a small town, but they're just not worth it. We tried it and it did not work. Even the wife's parents weren't very welcoming, which sucked because it was a main reason why we moved there. They didn't seem interested in having a big part in our kids' lives, which was sad. Glad we moved to my home city and will never leave the city again.